The case of the escaped smallpox patient Michael Burns was also covered in The Sun with a few additional details. Saturday, March 25, 1893, The Sun. Fever kept Burns warm. The long tramp and exposure of a smallpox patient. He thought he was looking for his little sister. He finds rest on a heap of refuse in the cold and rain. Recaptured. Michael Burns, the delirious smallpox patient who escaped from the Long Island City pest house in Thompson Avenue and Hulse Street, that city, about 10:30 on Thursday night, has been recaptured. His wanderings led him through many of the small villages in the town of Newtown, and he finally brought up at the Grand Street horse-car stables in Maspeth, from which place he was sent back to the hospital. When nurse Robert Kennedy first discovered that Burns was missing from his ward, it was thought that he had got away naked. This was not the case. He was discovered early yesterday morning by residents of Maspeth and Newtown, attired in an old suit of clothes, going from door to door in an aimless way. He said he was in search of his sister Katie. His clothing was dripping wet, and he was shivering with cold. About 6:30, Henry Martin, night watchman in the village, found him lying exhausted on a heap of refuse in Fisk Avenue between Newtown and Maspeth villages. As Burns was unable to give any rational account of himself, Martin arrested him as a vagrant. He was next turned over to the custody of Constable David Holdworth, who escorted him to the village hall in Court Street, Newtown. While waiting in the courtroom, Burns's inflamed face occasioned some comment, but no one guessed what ailed him. Apparently totally unconscious of his surroundings, Burns spent his time looking for his sister Katie, to the amusement of the spectators in the place. When Justice Howard entered, he saw at a glance that the prisoner was ill, and in response to his inquiry, Burns said he was suffering with a fever and had left a hospital but a few hours before. "What fever did you have?" said the justice kindly. "Typhus?" "Yes," innocently responded Burns. "Typhus fever." Instantly there was a stampede in the place. Officials and spectators fell over one another in their hurry to get out. Justice Howard alone retained his composure, and giving Burns money for car fare, he told him to get out of the village by the shortest possible route. Burns dragged himself out of the place good-naturedly and took up a position on a corner on the main thoroughfare. Finally, car 20 came along, and Burns seemed to board the car as a matter of course. Among the passengers on the car was County Judge Garretson's 6-year-old son, James Garretson, accompanied by an elderly woman. Burns feelingly inquired from each passenger if he or she had seen his little sister, and extended his inquiries to driver William Miller, who reported the man's queer actions to Foreman George Robinson at the car stables. Mr. Robinson had Burns brought out of the car for inspection, and at once he saw that he was ill and out of his head. While Mr. Robinson was thinking what he had best do with Burns, along came lawyer George Fisher. On catching sight of Burns, he threw up his hands and ejaculated, "Good heavens, that man's got the smallpox." Mr. Robinson and lawyer Fisher stood their ground, but the crowd of sympathetic spectators who had gathered near the place continued their observations about a block to the windward of Burns. Lawyer Fisher, then, had Burns open his shirt front in order to confirm his diagnosis. Both he and Mr. Robinson then concluded that Burns was the man of whose escape from the Long Island City pest house the night before they had heard. The authorities in Long Island City were notified. In the meantime, Mr. Robinson had the car, on which Burns rode as a passenger, hauled off the tracks to the side of the road and proceeded to fumigate it. He also built a fire in the street, and putting on a bucket of tar, he fixed a place near the blaze where Burns could keep warm until taken back to the pest hospital. After the arrangements were completed, Lawyer Fisher took up a station on the opposite side of the street, and at the top of his lungs warned all approaching pedestrians to steer clear of Burns. Burns was hidden in a cloud of smoke from the tar fire. Before the health wagon from Long Island City reached the stables, Constables James Highland and Holdsworth drove up to the place in an open wagon, and despite the protests of Foreman Robinson, they put Burns into the back of the wagon and drove with him to the Queens County Jail in Long Island City. There was a long delay here until the constables were finally convinced that Burns did not belong there but at the city pest house, and then followed another wagon ride for the worn-out patient. Eventually, the wagon reached the pest house, and Burns was put to bed again. Dr. McCune was there to receive him, and was surprised to find that he had apparently suffered little from his long tramp and exposure. It is supposed that his fever had in a measure counteracted the cold. He was still delirious, and in answer to the doctor's questions, insisted that he had permission to see his mother. Burns is only 18 years old and was taken to the pest house from his home in 51 Jackson Avenue, Long Island City on Tuesday. Nurse Kennedy was alone with the patient when he says Burns became suddenly violent Thursday night, a short time before Stephen Kelsey, who drives the department wagon, had gone for milk and was still absent. He did not get back until after 12 o'clock that night. Burns is a stalwart young man, and Kennedy said he was unable to cope with him. According to his story, Burns succeeded in getting out of bed during the struggle and began smashing everything in the room. He at length got possession of a knife and forced Kennedy to beat a retreat, but Kennedy locked the door behind him, thinking to hold Burns a prisoner until Kelsey returned. Shortly afterward, the disturbance in the room ceased, and when Kennedy cautiously opened the door again, he found the window wrenched open and the room empty. The place is surrounded by a fence 15 feet high. There were several iron bedsteads in the yard, waiting occupants in the hospital, and Burns scaled the fence by using one of these bedsteads as a sort of ladder. The whole police reserve was ordered out in the chase that followed. Several physicians also joined, in addition to a small army of sanitary inspectors. Dr. McCune, physician to the pest house, scoured the country on horseback. It is thought Burns probably dressed himself after being locked in his room by the nurse. Letter carrier Robert H. Bagling of 4th Street, ex-Alderman Hugo Schmidt of 311 Moore Street, and Katie Kotler of 143 9th Avenue were the new cases of smallpox reported in Long Island City yesterday.